Applause broke across the ninth floor of Meridian Global like a sudden wave. Rebecca Shaw stood near the glass conference room, voice bright and carrying, telling everyone she had finally removed the last obstacle between herself and the director's chair. Laughter followed. Someone clapped her on the shoulder. A few people already reached for the champagne flutes that had appeared on the side table, as if by magic. Ethan Hale did not look up. He folded the last of his notebooks into a cardboard box, straightened the edge of the packing tape, and lifted it with both hands. The weight was light, for years of work reduced to paper and a single spare charger. He walked the length of the open floor without speaking. No one stepped aside for him. No one asked where he was going. The elevator doors, opened on cue, swallowed him, and closed again with a soft hydraulic sigh. For a moment the celebration continued without interruption. Rebecca raised a glass. Someone called for a toast. The sound of voices rose, easy and relieved. Then the elevator returned. The doors parted and Olivia Sterling stepped out. She moved faster than usual, the sharp lines of her coat still unsettled by motion. In one hand she held a thick contract bound with a black clip. Her face had lost its color. She stopped in the center of the floor and scanned the room once, eyes moving past the raised glasses and the scattered smiles until they found nothing. The noise thinned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the low hum of the air system seemed to pause. Olivia's voice cut through what remained. "Where is he?" For years earlier the same desk had looked almost identical. A monitor, a keyboard, 3 legal pads stacked with the edges perfectly aligned. No photographs. No coffee mug with a joke printed on the side. No framed certificate or plastic award. People walked past it every day and rarely glanced twice. Ethan Hale arrived before the rest of the floor most mornings, coat still damp from the school drop-off. He set a paper bag with Lily's unfinished toast on the passenger seat of his car and carried only a thermos of black coffee upstairs. The arithmetic of his week never changed. School at 8. Pick up at 3:15 on the days he could leave early. Dinner by 6. Homework at the kitchen table. Bedtime stories that had to end before the next time zone's conference call began. Twice the company opened a management track. Twice the deadline passed without his name on the list. Human resources assumed he lacked ambition. The truth was simpler. Management meant travel, and travel was the one variable his life could not absorb. He took the work no one else wanted instead. Accounts that had gone silent, compliance packages rejected 40 hours before deadline, payment schedules that needed rewriting at midnight. He fixed them from the desk by the window and never stood up afterward to claim the credit. Gregory Doyle, who sat 2 rows over, once described him at lunch as the guy who fixes stuff. The phrase was not meant unkindly. It simply settled over Ethan like furniture. He never corrected it. On the rare days when a Cleveland distributor stopped returning calls for 5 weeks, Ethan rebuilt the relationship over 11 careful conversations. When the Western Region's filing came back rejected, he found the error at 2 in the morning and had a corrected package on a courier's truck by 7. The floor knew these things happened. Almost no one connected them to the quiet man whose desk held nothing personal at all. Rebecca Shaw reviewed the correspondence logs every Friday afternoon the way other people check stock prices. She sat alone in her glass-walled office after the floor had thinned, scrolling through client threads with the precision of someone building a case. The numbers always looked strong when she summarized them upstairs. She had led strategic accounts for 2.5 years, and the department's performance had become her most reliable argument. Yet the same name kept appearing beneath the largest recoveries and the quietest saves. Not in the subject lines she presented to leadership, but in the long chains of emails no one else bothered to open. Cleveland. Phoenix. The compliance rescue that arrived with only hours to spare. Each time the raw record pointed back to the desk by the window. She told herself this was normal. Managers presented team results. That was the job. The language of we was simply leadership. For a long time the explanation held. Then the director of the commercial division announced his retirement for the fall. Suddenly, the story grew harder to maintain. Rebecca had already met informally with 2 board members. Her presentation deck sat at 11 polished slides. She knew exactly what stood between her and the title. It was not a rival applicant. It was the quiet concentration of results that refused to spread across a team. On those Friday afternoons, she would close the logs, straighten the already perfect stack of folders on her desk, and look out across the floor toward the bare workstation near the glass. The discomfort settled lower each week, a pressure she refused to name. Ambition required a clean narrative. The desk by the window kept threatening to complicate it. The Whitfield Industries opportunity began with almost nothing. A cold introduction at a trade conference in March, a brief exchange of cards under fluorescent lights, and a follow-up email that might easily have gone unanswered. Marshall Reed handled North American partnerships for Whitfield and carried a reputation across the industry as a man who walked away from suppliers without explanation. Handshake problems, he called them. 3 companies in 2 years had learned what that phrase meant. Ethan answered the first email at an hour most people considered unreasonable. He answered the second the same way. He never oversold. He never promised what the company could not deliver. Over weeks, the conversation lengthened into something more careful. Questions about capacity, about timelines, about how problems had been handled in the past. Reed responded to precision the way other executives responded to charm. By July, the discussion had become a negotiation. By September, the outline of an agreement sat on the table. $42 million over 3 years, the largest single contract in Meridian Global's history. Rebecca presented every progress update upstairs. She used the word "we" until it lost its shape. The monthly reviews received the reports as departmental success. No one asked to see the correspondence underneath. No one needed to. The numbers looked clean. Ethan never corrected the language. He continued the late calls, the careful revisions, the quiet work of keeping a difficult client from walking away. The deal that should have belonged to everyone continued to rest, almost entirely, on the desk by the window. The kitchen light stayed on long after the rest of the house went dark. Lily had fallen asleep with a book still open on her chest. Ethan closed it gently, pulled the blanket higher, and returned to the table where his laptop waited beside a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. The call with Marshall Reed began at 10:30. Whitfield's executive committee sat 11 hours ahead, and the final language on liability transfer needed to be settled before their board convened. Ethan kept his voice low, so the sound would not travel down the short hallway. Marshall pressed hard on a limitation Meridian's legal team had inserted. The clause protected the company more than the partnership. Most suppliers would have defended it. Ethan did not. He said the language tilted too far in Meridian's favor and offered alternative wording that gave Whitfield more room. Silence stretched on the other end of the line. When Marshall spoke again, his tone had changed. He said that in 19 years, he had never heard a supplier argue against his own legal department at 4 a.m. That single choice, he added, was the reason he was prepared to sign. They worked through the remaining schedule clause by clause. The call ended at 10 minutes to 5. Ethan closed the laptop, sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen, and looked toward the doorway where his daughter slept. 2 hours of rest remained before the school run. He did not write the conversation down. It did not occur to him that the moment would matter to anyone but the 2 men on the call. Morning light cut across the 9th floor in thin, uneven strips. Core hours had begun at 9. Ethan stepped off the elevator at 20 minutes to 10, badge still swinging from the lanyard. Phone dark in his pocket because he had unplugged it the night before to keep the laptop alive. 2 hours of sleep sat behind his eyes like grit. Rebecca had been at her desk since 8. At 8:41, she opened a departmental template and generated the document she intended to use before the week ended. She watched him cross the floor with the quiet attention of someone who had already made a decision and had just been handed a cleaner reason for it. The 40 minutes did not create the choice. They simply removed the last soft edge from it. She noted the time without writing it down. The folder already waited on the corner of her desk, printed and signed in the places that required only her name. Across the open space, Ethan set his bag down, powered on the monitor, and reached for the Whitfield file he had carried home the previous night. He moved the way he always moved, precise, unhurried, as if the lateness belonged to someone else. Rebecca rose, smoothed the front of her jacket, and walked toward the corner conference room. The morning still felt ordinary to everyone else on the floor. To her, it had already begun to tilt. Rebecca asked Gregory Doyle to join them as a departmental witness. She did not explain the reason. Doyle followed her into the corner conference room with the mild curiosity of someone who expected routine paperwork. Ethan entered a moment later, still holding the Whitfield file. He set it on the table without opening it and took the chair nearest the door. Rebecca began with the time of his arrival. 40 minutes past the start of core hours. She spoke in the measured tone she used for performance reviews, listing the lateness as the latest mark in a longer pattern of unreliability. The words were careful, almost clinical. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The document she had prepared earlier already waited in front of her, signature lines clear. Ethan listened without interrupting. He did not offer the explanation of the all-night call or the 2 hours of sleep. He did not mention Lily or the dead phone. When Rebecca finished, she slid the resignation form across the table. Voluntary, the heading read, effective immediately. The language framed the decision as mutual, a clean departure for the good of the team. He read the single page once. Then he signed his name in the space provided. The pen moved without hesitation. Doyle watched from the side, expression carefully neutral. No one asked Ethan to speak. He did not volunteer anything. When the form was complete, he stood, collected the Whitfield file, and returned to his desk. The cardboard box already sat half-packed on the chair. He added the last notebooks, the charger, and the 3 legal pads that had always rested at the corner. The monitor went dark. He lifted the box with both hands and walked toward the elevator without looking back. Rebecca stepped out of the conference room and raised her voice so the entire floor could hear. She told them the last obstacle between her and the director's chair had finally been cleared. Applause started near the printer and spread quickly. Someone laughed. A few people already reached for the champagne flutes that had appeared on the side table as if the moment had been expected. The sound of celebration filled the open space, bright and relieved. Ethan walked past them carrying the cardboard box. He did not look at the raised glasses or the faces turned toward Rebecca. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside. The doors closed on the noise behind him. While the floor celebrated, a different conversation had already ended 3 floors above. Olivia Sterling sat alone in her office, the receiver still warm in her hand. Marshall Reed had called her directly that morning. His voice carried none of its usual measured patience. He asked for one person by name. He wanted confirmation that Ethan Hale remained in a client-facing role at Meridian Global. When Olivia could not give him an immediate answer, Reed made the position clear. The continuity clause in the final annex was not a formality. If Ethan was no longer with the company, Whitfield would walk. The $42 million agreement would not survive the signature stage. Olivia had opened the annex herself after the call. The language was unambiguous. She had not known the clause existed until that morning. Rebecca's progress reports had never mentioned it. The celebration continuing below her was already happening on borrowed time. She gathered the bound contract, left her office without explanation, and walked toward the elevator that would take her to the 9th floor. The final annex had arrived the previous Thursday as an email attachment. 40 pages of dense legal language, schedules, and appendices. Rebecca saw the file size, noted the subject line, and dragged it into the Whitfield folder without opening it. She had a board dinner that evening. The main terms were already settled. Whatever remained, she told herself, was paperwork. She intended to read it later. Later never came. Inside those unread pages sat the clause Marshall Reed had insisted on during the last round of revisions. It had been negotiated across 4 separate private calls between Reed and Ethan alone. No one else from Meridian had been on the line. The language was precise. The entire agreement would become void if Ethan Hale was no longer employed by Meridian Global in a client-facing capacity at the time of signing. Continuity of personnel was not a preference. It was a condition. Ethan had never mentioned the clause to Rebecca. He treated it as one more detail in a long negotiation, the kind of practical safeguard a careful client would request after months of direct work with a single contact. He assumed the legal team would review it. He assumed the attachment would be read. Rebecca closed her laptop that Thursday evening, checked her reflection once in the dark office glass, and left for the dinner. The annex remained unopened in the shared drive. The celebration that would take place 5 days later was already being built on a document no one in leadership had examined. The elevator doors opened for the second time that morning. Olivia Sterling stepped onto the 9th floor with the bound contract held tightly in one hand. Her face had lost its usual color. The sharp lines of her coat still carried the speed of her walk from the executive level. She stopped in the center of the open space and let her eyes move once across the raised glasses, the scattered smiles, the half-formed toast that had not yet been spoken. Every sound thinned and then stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. A champagne flute hovered in the air and did not descend. Even the low mechanical hum of the floor seemed to pause. Olivia's voice cut through what remained. "Where is he?" No one answered. Rebecca's expression shifted first. Something tight and calculating moving behind her eyes as the question landed with its full weight. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and glanced toward the elevator bank. The doors were already shut. The car was gone. Olivia did not wait for an explanation. She held the contract slightly higher so the black clip and the thickness of the pages were visible to everyone. "This is the Whitfield agreement," she said. Her tone stayed even, but the words carried across the silence without effort. $42 million. The largest contract this company has ever negotiated. It contains a continuity clause that voids the entire deal if Ethan Hale is no longer in a client-facing role here. Marshall Reed called me this morning. He is prepared to walk. The implications settled over the floor like a sudden drop in temperature. Rebecca's face continued to change as the pieces arranged themselves in public. The celebration that had felt so. Olivia's first instruction was simple. Find him. Calls went out to Ethan's mobile. The phone remained dark. Messages stacked unanswered. Someone checked the lobby cameras and confirmed he had already left the building with the cardboard box under one arm. The trail ended at the street. While the search continued, Olivia requested the raw correspondence logs for the Strategic Accounts Department. The files arrived within minutes. She opened them on a shared screen in the corner conference room so the relevant threads could be examined without filter. The pattern emerged quickly. Cleveland, Phoenix, the compliance rescue. The long, careful sequence of messages that had built the Whitfield relationship. Nearly every critical recovery and every difficult client conversation traced back to the same address. The polished monthly summaries Rebecca had delivered upstairs had smoothed those individual efforts into collective language. The raw record did not. Colleagues who had spent years accepting the departmental narrative began to see the shape of the work differently. Conversations that had once been summarized as team progress now appeared as one man's late-night replies and precise revisions. The quiet desk by the window no longer looked empty of ambition. It looked like the center of results no one had bothered to examine closely. Rebecca stood near the glass wall and said little. The explanation she might once have offered no longer fit the documents open on the screen. Olivia closed the files after a final review and made a decision that could not be reversed. She instructed HR to prepare an immediate statement for Whitfield confirming that Meridian Global would do everything required to restore the continuity the contract demanded. The celebration was over. The consequences had begun. They found him mid-afternoon in the small park 3 blocks from the school, sitting on a bench with the cardboard box on the ground beside him. Lily's pickup was still more than an hour away. He had been watching the empty playground equipment move slightly in the wind. Olivia arrived without an entourage. She sat on the opposite end of the bench and laid out the situation in clean, factual language. The continuity clause, Marshall Reed's position, the offer of immediate reinstatement, a revised title that protected his client relationships, and a compensation adjustment that reflected the actual value of the work. She did not apologize for the morning. She simply stated what the company needed and what it was prepared to provide. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked toward the school building in the distance and spoke only once. He would return long enough to close the Whitfield agreement and ensure the transition was clean. After that, he would leave on his own terms, with enough notice for the client and no further obligation to the floor that had celebrated his departure. The role she offered would require the kind of availability he had spent 4 years protecting against. Lily still needed him home at predictable hours. That calculation had not changed. Olivia accepted the boundary without argument. The consequence for Rebecca arrived separately and without public drama. Removal from the director track, a formal note in her file regarding the unexamined annex, and a reassignment that placed her outside strategic accounts. The language was administrative. The effect was permanent. Ethan remained on the bench after Olivia left. He checked the time, stood, and lifted the box. The path back to the school was short. The decision already felt settled inside him, quiet and final. The Whitfield agreement closed 11 days later. Ethan returned only for the final calls and the signature meeting. He negotiated the remaining details on terms that protected both the client relationship and the boundaries he had set. Marshall Reed signed without further conditions. The $42 million moved from possibility into the company's ledger. When the last document was filed, Ethan cleared his desk for the second time, this time without a cardboard box waiting. He left a short transition note and walked out while the floor was still busy with ordinary work. Rebecca's reassignment took effect the same week. The director track closed behind her without ceremony. Colleagues who had once accepted her summaries now spoke of the correspondence logs in quieter tones. The narrative she had built over 2.5 years did not survive the raw record. She remained employed, but the path she had cleared so carefully no longer existed. Ethan's former desk stayed empty for several days. Then someone placed a single-framed photograph on the corner. Lily at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, looking up at the camera with the unguarded concentration of a child who still believed evenings lasted forever. No one removed it. The people who need to be seen often spend their energy ensuring the light falls on them. The ones whose work is simply necessary rarely ask for the light at all. They keep the difficult accounts from collapsing, answer the late calls, and protect the small, fixed arithmetic of home. In the end, the difference is rarely dramatic. It is only that one kind of effort can be replaced and the other cannot. Integrity does not always announce itself. Sometimes it is noticed only after it has already walked out the door and chosen, without bitterness, not to return.